feminists hate the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope, kind of for good reason. If you don't know what that is, it's a stock character that I'm sure you've seen in films before, a cute, bubbly, kind of crazy young woman who helps the male protagonist, usually a depressed young man, get in touch with his feelings, feel passion, go on an adventure, and grow as a person. So feminists are actually right that she is a one-dimensional, totally unrealistic representation of a woman. However, if you haven't guessed, I'm bringing this up because as a stock character, as an archetype in film, a trope, it represents something very deep about the male unconscious. So in the Mother Complex episode, I pointed out how for an adult man to be drawn to a Mrs. Robinson, MILF type of character, or that storyline, it usually means that he himself sees himself as a boy. So he's unconsciously being driven towards some sort of validation from a mother figure, right? The Manic Pixie Dream Girl psychological significance is similar but different. It's typically a sign that this man cannot connect to his own feelings. So in this episode, we're going to speak about the psychological background, obviously, of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, a little bit about how it showed up in culture because actually it didn't really exist in fiction until the 1930s. I'm going to connect it to some other stock characters that have existed a little bit longer, the ingenue or damsel in distress or the femme fatale or the nymph. And I actually think the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is kind of a convergence of these older archetypes because of something that shifted in the male collective unconscious in the early 20th century. But then we're also going to bring this out of the fiction world where, mythology or a representation of the collective is shown into how this shows up in real relating with women. Because on the one hand, what guy wouldn't be attracted to these qualities in a woman, right? So a woman who's always happy and adoring and, a little bit crazy and super fun, like it's normal to be attracted to that evolutionarily, if you will. And I'd also say it's also an archetype, unlike the Mrs. Robinson, which is kind of a, we could say it's kind of an unusual kink. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl, or the qualities that we would associate with that, is pretty normal to be expressed in women. I actually think this archetype is in basically all straight women, right? If you've ever been with a woman or you've seen a woman act a little bit girlier than her age, whatever her age is, around a man she's attracted to, that's a normal thing, right? Women start to feel a little bit girlier, more innocent. Men are attracted to this. It's kind of part of the human mating ritual. However, there's also a danger here in that men who are overly drawn to this or who get stuck to or attached to these kinds of behaviors in women to an unrealistic level, because of course, no woman's going to be like that all the time, right? It's not normal for a person to be happy all the time or adore their man all the time. It's just not a real person. It can point to some wounds or a lack of completion in said man. Namely the savior complex or some other things. And I've seen a lot of guys get into trouble, let's say, in relationships where their behavior is incentivizing an over girliness in their partner. And it's not quite as bad as the mother complex thing where you're turning your partner into your mother, but it's something that can also cause a lot of problems for guys. And real quick, a lot of what I'm sharing in this episode is coming from a book I'm in the process of writing on Taming the Anima. I finally decided to write a relationship book based on what I know of Jungian psychology and obviously many years of coaching men and women in relationships. I kind of wanted to create this is the nerdy way to put it, but like a unified theory of relating to women or relating to the feminine. So this book, which is probably going to come out some weeks after this episode comes out, it's based on like what are the universal principles that are applicable to understanding women when you're dating, or maybe you're a younger man, or understanding women when you're in a long-term relationship or marriage. Like, what are the unifying principles? Basically, the things that I wish I understood at a very young age. Since the book won't be out till after this episode, I'll attach a link to this, either a pre-sale link or an opt-in to be notified if you're interested in that book when it comes out. But this episode is on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, Key to Man's Passion. So as I mentioned in the intro, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is a relatively new trope. Like if you go further back from before the 20th century, you don't see her existing, right? There is no Manic Pixie Dream Girl in Shakespeare. There are other tropes that you'll see in more ancient mythology, but you don't see this kind of character, right? There's two maybe related archetypes that you see in fiction, the ingenue or damsel in distress. This is a woman who, she's the princess in the tower, right? Similar to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, she doesn't have a lot going on in her life other than she needs to be saved by the male protagonist, by the hero. There's also the nymph or the man-eater, the siren, succubus, basically kind of the opposite of the ingenue. The ingenue is an innocent woman, a virgin of some sort. The nymph or the siren is a hypersexual woman. I think later that became the femme fatale, like this woman who is super sexy and maybe immoral, and like tempts the man away from his more ordered life or his morality. And, also known as the man-eater. This is the trope that kind of ruins men, right? And I actually feel like these two tropes kind of converged, I guess, in the 1930s when we started to see the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in film, as a sign of a shift in the male collective unconscious, if you will. So if we go on the Jungian idea that I shared in the intro on how recurring fantasies in the form of, say, archetypes are a sign of a desire for completion or a desire for growth in an individual unconscious. If you look at the ingenue, it's pretty obvious, right? The ingenue represents a man who wants to be a hero. He wants to literally save the princess. He's going to slay the dragon and, in those kinds of proverbial mythologies and save this helpless woman who needed him and will appreciate him and will love him because of his deeds, right? Because he did the hard thing. The femme fatale is a little bit different of, I would say, maybe the dark side of that, of a man who has these temptations. Like you think of, actually we could use like, say, the sirens in the Odyssey, right? The sirens were they're these demons, but they looked like beautiful women and they sang the most enchanting, most beautiful song in the whole world that made sailors drive their ships onto their island and crash their boats. And then those women, those siren demons would then eat the sailors, right? We're gonna come back and actually reference that myth. But what's the psychological significance of that? It's like all of the temptations that men have that maybe they don't want to act on. And if we look at like, ancient mythologies or, more chivalry-based mythologies, like that kind of woman represents temptation. Or if you look at some of the film noir movies, or Humphrey Bogart or Maltese Falcon, these kinds of like detective novels or detective films rather, where like this sexy woman who like, just from the way the music comes on when she walks onto the screen, like, she's trouble, she's maybe not being honest, she's deceptive, she's gonna maybe send the hero or anti-hero on this dark journey, but he can't help it, right? She's so beautiful and alluring, and he was bored sitting at his desk, right? That represents temptation, right? And the convergence of this, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, well, on the one hand, as I mentioned, in those films, I'm thinking of, say, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character in 50 Shades of Summer, he's kind of a loser. Or Edward Norton's character in Fight Club, like he's a guy who's kind of well put together, but like he doesn't really understand women. He's probably lonely. Like it's kind of implied that he doesn't get girls, to put it like that. And here this amazing woman, this dream girl, pops into his life that'll show him the ropes, right? So he's not quite a hero. I would say almost similar to the mother complex thing. Like he doesn't see himself fully as a man. He doesn't see himself as a boy, right? Usually he has his adult material life together. He has a job, he does normal things, but he's not connected to his soul. He's not connected to his passion. And why I would say, and this is me a bit speculating, but why this started to show up, let's say in the early 20th century, is that this was a time in the history of civilization where men were starting to become more domesticated. This is a whole other tangent that I'm not going to get into in this episode, but if you look at some of the writers from the late 19th, early 20th century, the Nietzsches, the G.K. Chestertons, guys who were very critical, or even like Theodore Roosevelt didn't write about this stuff, but he kind of represented this, like, fighting against the domestication of men. You could see that this, probably because of, the rise of technology and the shift, towards social issues. Basically, men were starting to become a little bit neutered culturally, and the backlash of this, or the effect of this is that men started to fantasize a little bit more, maybe for the first time in the history of culture, let's say, men started to fantasize about a woman who would lead them onto an adventure. As opposed to, if we could just imagine a young man in the 1500s or, you know, in biblical times or whatever. It's like, yeah, a man might get tempted by the nymph, the femme fatale, the siren. He might want to be a good man and save the princess. But the idea that you would need a woman to guide you, that you need a woman to help you access your strength or your passions or your drive, I think that would have been kind of just a ridiculous concept before the 20th century, right? Like men, you know, men for all their flaws or inadequacies or wounds, which of course exist in certain ways, I don't think they had that wound. They weren't missing that. So the fact that this became an interesting enough type of character that it would show up in fiction, and I'm actually thinking now, it probably did exist even before the 20th century. In various Charles Dickens novels, there is a kind of Manic Pixie Dream Girl type of character. Like, it's almost like in a harsh way. If you read Great Expectations, it's like a woman who like is kind of mean to the guy. You know, she's kind of taking advantage of the fact that the guy is not very confident and he's disconnected from his power and his passion. Or W. Somerset Maugham has books of the same type. The Book of Human Bondage is another example where like the entire novel, the main character is constantly being mistreated and like he hopes to get this kiss from this woman who keeps taking advantage of him. This is the dark side of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the fact that this type of character was interesting enough that enough men were drawn to it that it became a stock character or a trope in fiction, to me is a sign that men started to feel like they were lacking this, right? They didn't just inherently have this within themselves. In a similar way that the MILF, Mrs. Robinson trope is only really compelling to a man who sees himself as a boy, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in her extreme only makes sense to a guy who's disconnected from his passions, a man who's overly domesticated, which is what I think started to happen in the late 19th, early 20th century. So from a psychological lens, we could say, perhaps, that the function of this archetype, whether it's in fiction or in real women, which we're going to talk about in a moment, because it does exist in most women to some degree, that the function of this archetype is to help a man to meet his soul, to connect with his emotions, to feel his passion for life, to feel his real confidence, as opposed to being a shell of a person, which is one, an expression of men that you see a lot in modern culture. Fight Club showed this in the movie. Edward Norton's character, before he goes on the adventure, he's literally a corporate slave. All he cares about is buying IKEA furniture. He's going through this meaningless existence. And then he meets, obviously, Tyler Durden, which turns out to be a figment of his imagination, but also Marla, who is a Manic Pixie Dream Girl. It's like this craving, or the function of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is to help a man break out of the monotony of a boring, soulless existence. But one of the things that's extra interesting about this archetype is that it's actually present in almost all women. As I mentioned earlier, at least the traits that we associate with this, the cuteness, the bubbliness, the adoringness, the girliness, is present in most women, right? If you've ever seen a woman be around a man that she's really attracted to or in love with or makes her swoon in some way, she tends to act more girly, regardless of her age. I've seen women in their 60s be around a guy that she's really attracted to and then start acting like a little girl, and her voice might get higher pitched. She'll laugh a little bit more, become a little bit more silly. Actually, one observation that I think feminists would get mad at, but I think it's true, which is why I'm saying it, is that I've noticed that when a woman's around a guy that she's really attracted to, she almost becomes a little bit dumber. And it doesn't make sense, because I've dated women who like were super intelligent, like maybe way more intelligent than me. And then it's like, while flirting or on a date or maybe progressing into a relationship, at times where she feels particularly happy and joyful and girly, it's almost like she forgets what she knows, or like she starts making mistakes. Actually, my wife, especially, she and I, we laugh a lot, especially when the kids go to bed, where we could get very silly. And she almost helps set up jokes, or helps set up unconsciously, I think, set up me teasing her about things, because while as really intelligent as she is, she kind of forgets things that she knows, which makes it easy to play with it. And I don't know this for sure, but it does remind me of Christopher Hitchens' article on why women aren't funny, which actually, he wasn't arguing that women weren't funny. He was arguing that women don't have to be funny. And for the human mating ritual to exist, the woman has to laugh at the man's jokes. Like, it's just part of it, which means if she's a lot funnier or a lot smarter, or like she has too much foresight to be surprised by his humor or to find it cute. Like if he just thinks he's boring, they're not going to mate. So like a woman kind of has to almost pretend, obviously it's better if it's authentic, but like almost pretend like the guy is funny. Anyways, this is all to say that the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope, it kind of points to how the man has to know a little bit more, which I think is also, aside from the fact that youthfulness and adoringness and happiness is just attractive, it makes the man feel a certain way. It makes the man feel extra competent. And I actually want to share something as we bring this into relations with women, because there's a light side to this and a dark side, is that I've dated a few women where this Manic Pixie Dream Girl archetype was very prominent. Like it was almost like the key feature of their personality. And there's one in particular. In my early 20s, she happened to be a drug addict, which I think is related to what I'm about to share. I of course was like, I was very much like the depressed male protagonist in any Manic Pixie Dream Girl rom-com. Like I was so clueless that she was an addict. Like I was just excited to be with a sexy woman who seemed to like me and had all these crazy ideas. But there's two things that were particularly attractive for me, and this points to both the positive side of this trope, because again, I think it's normal for a woman to act a little girly and manic as part of the human mating ritual. But there's also the dark side, which is, well, the two things that were attractive to me in particular was I was a guy stuck in my head, kind of depressed. I had just left my, what was my last and kind of my only real corporate job. I was struggling as an entrepreneur for 6 months. I had very little purpose. I didn't know what to do with my life. I was very inhibited. I was putting in a lot of work. You know, I'd go to the gym. I would go out and approach women because that was the only way I knew to like improve my confidence. And then this manic pixie young woman appeared in my life. And for some reason, she really liked me. And I didn't have to like game her. Like she just liked me for some reason, for who I was. And she also brought this joy to my life that I didn't have. Because on the one hand, of course, having a beautiful woman adore you is validating and fun, and it's what every straight man wants to some degree. But it was also particularly addicting because I didn't have anything else going on in my life. Like my career was going nowhere. I was kind of confused about my purpose in life. I was having all these existential problems. And not only did she come in and love me and we had great sex and we'd gone on adventures, is that she became my source for fun. She became my source for passion, for feeling anything, actually, in both ways. But initially it was all the positive stuff. But then also, you know, she would act so irrationally and pull on my heartstrings, I think completely unintentionally, no hard feelings against her. But like, she like made me feel so many emotions, and that in itself was very addicting, right? Because the rest of my life was kind of anhedonic. Like I just wasn't feeling things. Like I would go throughout my days like not knowing what to do with myself and like putting a lot of effort into something, but not knowing like the reason for it, all of this stuff. But with her, there was always a purpose, which is the second aspect of this in the movies, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, in many, let's say in rom-coms, she's just like a perfect woman, right? She's just there to love and guide the hero into his feelings. In real life, when a woman behaves this way, usually there's another aspect to it, or there's like a flip side to this where she's manic. So in real life, she creates problems for herself. And in this case, in this particular relationship, she also happened to be a drug addict, which I found out later, because I was so naive. But she would create so many problems in her life. She'd have all these crazy ideas and things that were kind of diluted, and go on these adventures and put herself in situations that were not very rational or safe. And then she'd call me to save her, or maybe I would be there with her and I would have to swoop in and be the white knight. And it was this combination of lots of joy, like these super high highs, and then these lows where I got to feel very important, because even though this was maybe not the best application of it, it is a universal male desire to be useful to women. So she would like get into car accidents, or like be in a situation where she owed a drug dealer money and she didn't have access to cash, or all sorts of like misadventures we had. And even though they were annoying and I'd be like, oh man, not again, I have to bail her out again in some way, it actually gave me a sense of purpose. And I think it's the combination of these two things that really made me addicted to her, right? I ended up doing a lot of drugs with her, not being so naive. I didn't realize her and all her friends were, major addicts. But But I was never addicted to the drugs. Actually, once I stopped dating her, I basically never touched cocaine again. I just wasn't, it was never my thing. I don't know. I never loved it, but I was super addicted to her because of this wound in me. So this is another important takeaway that I think relates to the savior complex, or what guys might refer to as being Captain Save-A-Ho, or, I mean, this is the term, right? It's like a guy who not only is drawn to women in need, but he might even bring out neediness or a lack of competence in the women he's with, because unconsciously he wants to feel important. He doesn't have things going on in his life that make him feel like a success or make him feel useful. So he seeks out, a quote, broken woman, or he seeks out a woman who can't figure out her own life, or, she has all these great ideas and she's super manic. She's super inner feelings. She represents the anima, if you will, but she can't figure out her life. So this guy gets to feel really important. So translating this archetype from film into real life, it's really important to understand, because like in a rom-com, the one-dimensional character might just stay one-dimensional. Like, she might just be there to delight the male protagonist or help him feel his emotions or connect to his heart or whatever, his passions, his confidence. But in real life, on the one hand, is a very beautiful aspect of women, right? As mentioned, when a woman genuinely likes a guy, usually she starts to act a little bit more girly. But on the other hand, a man who's overly attached to this, it might be driven by some wound, which is not useful to him, nor is it useful for the woman that he might be dating. Because as mentioned, the function of this archetype in women is to help men feel, to help men connect to what Jung would refer to as the anima, his feminine side, right? And I know a lot of guys maybe don't want to think of themselves as having a feminine side. I would ground this very simply of saying, if your masculinity are all the traits that correlate with testosterone, your femininity, your feminine side, are essentially your oxytocin receptors, right? Like anything that makes you feel soft or cute, helps you downregulate your nervous system, helps you feel less like machismo and more relaxed, which is an important part of just being a human being. Although the balance of those two elements are different in men and women, it's an important thing, right? And this is on the pure side, it's a gift that women give men, or women give straight men. Like the love of a woman, I posted a reel on this recently on how oxytocin is the best down-regulating neurotransmitter, right? If you're being cuddled by your partner, or you're having sex with a woman, or you're in a situation, even non-sexual, where like you're like the social bonding is allowing oxytocin to flood your system, it's signaling to you as a man that you're not at war anymore. You're not on the hunt anymore. You can relax, you can recharge, you can enter your parasympathetic state, you can, rebuild your body and reset your nervous system, if you will. And that is a gift that women, especially when they're in this manic pixie girl mode, like when they're in their feminine, in a sense, incentivizes a man to feel this way. It allows the man to rest and recover. But there's the dark side, whereas the guy who's overly attached to this, he might actually be limiting himself, because while this is a gift that the feminine or women can bring a man, if a guy is craving it, or he's unable to connect to his own anima, his own feelings, and he becomes dependent on it, he ends up in a weird situation where, or actually, you see this with guys who maybe other guys will refer to as Captain Save-A-Ho. He constantly seeks out this kind of woman to feel okay about himself. Like he can't do that for himself, and actually points to his own wounding. And when it comes to the health of a relationship dynamic, on the one hand, if a woman is expressing this kind of manic pixie dream girl archetype with you, it's not the worst sign, right? It's better than her acting like your mother, right? If you're stuck in mother complex mode, referring to that episode, and your partner, for every time you date a woman, after a couple months, she starts acting like your mommy, that's a really bad sign, right? That means that's a reflection of you still seeing yourself as a boy. Manic Pixie Dream Girls is a little bit better, right? It's a sign that she, a woman's not going to go into that hyper feminine girly state if she sees you as a little kid. So at the very least, she sees you as competent. However, this part won't be too prominent, or it won't constantly keep coming out in a woman if she sees you as a source of your own passion, right? And if I look back at this relationship I had with my ex, who was an addict, if I was really driven, if I was bringing some fun and adventure and coming up with my own ideas of like, let's do this, or I'm going to whisk you away on that, if I was leading in that way, I don't think she would have acted like that, at least not to the extreme that she was. And on the one hand, that was kind of her personality, especially fueled by drugs and addiction. But on the other hand, if I was also bringing my own emotions, if I was also, doing things and leading interactions where she was feeling like she was also on an adventure, or she could be in the passenger seat sometimes, that wouldn't have been our dynamic, where I was always her savior and she was always the manic pixie. So if you find yourself in this dynamic in dating, in a current relationship, or you have this pattern in relationships, it's a sign that there's some opportunities for growth. And I'm going to share two ideas that I feel can help a man move out of this dynamic, because on the one hand, in the beginning of a relationship, it's really fun to have this kind of mania, but continued on, it's very tiring. And I would actually say, similar to how I mentioned the mother complex episode, is like a guy who really sees himself as a man and he doesn't need the validation of women is probably not going to be drawn to the Mrs. Robinson archetype, right? A guy who's self-directed, who really sees himself as an adult, is not going to want that dynamic where he has to basically act like a boy. In this case, I would say, beyond, let's say, initial stages or momentary flirtation or moments of fun, my wife, she expresses this kind of character at times, but it's not all day, right? She wouldn't be able to function as a mother or a wife in an adult relationship if she acted like this all the time. It's fun in moments, but if it's extended or if it's going beyond its usefulness, a guy who's really secure in himself is not going to be attached to that, right? A guy who's really secure in himself is not going to constantly be chasing broken women that he can fix and feel like a savior. Like, he's going to be bored with that, or it's not going to be a good use of his time if he has other things that he wants to create in the world. So I want to share two takeaways or two actionable steps that would help a guy move out of this phase if you find yourself constantly stuck in this pattern with women in a way that is, you can assess as draining your energy and maybe not useful to the woman either. The first idea is a phrase that has come up with, it came up initially with one of my clients that I was coaching around his dating life, and I kind of bring it up with other clients sometimes, is the idea of being the motorcycle. So this particular client that I was coaching him some time ago, he found himself in a pattern that was kind of like this, right? He was constantly not exactly taking care of women, but he seemed to bring the crazy out of women. And he kept ending up in relationships with women who were very chaotic, particularly chaotic. And I do want to say, as maybe a sidebar, on the one hand, it's totally normal that once a relationship moves into deeper emotional trust and intimacy or commitment, that a woman's deeper emotions comes out. And I think this is a normal thing. In the same way that this aspect of the feminine serves a purpose in helping men grow, I do think in most relationships, a woman who has some baggage or hurt or micro traumas, especially with relating to men, it's normal for it to come out once she feels safe with a man. So just because a woman has negative emotions or she's sharing aspects that she didn't show during the early courtship process, that's not a bad thing in itself. But this particular guy, he kept, all of his relationships, it turned out like the woman was particularly nuts and chaotic and destructive. And he's like, why do I keep ending up this way? Or why do I keep choosing women like this? Or is there something I'm doing that's bringing this out in women? And we, after, some time of working together, he came to me one day and said, I realized that because I didn't know how to have fun in my life, I kept choosing these women that were very exciting and maybe had some darkness in them because I wanted to hop on the back of their motorcycle. I was like, my life is boring. I'm going to hop on the back and be a passenger on their motorcycle, and they're going to take me on adventures. This was his metaphor. So with us, it became like a thing. It became like our phrase of how can you be the motorcycle? It was actually meant to be, how can you be the driver of the motorcycle? But it became our game of you be the motorcycle. How do you be the motorcycle? How can you be the one or have your own vehicle to have fun in life so that you can invite a woman, a great woman, to be the passenger on the back of your motorcycle as opposed to being the passenger on hers. And on the one hand, there is a polarity dynamic of, I do think it's important for the man to be the leader, and in hetero relationships, that's usually what both parties actually want deep down. It's evolutionary consistent, but I don't think it's always necessarily to be the case. The most important thing, though, is that you as a man aren't dependent on your partner to have fun. Are there negatives to a woman being dependent on the man to have fun? Maybe, I'm sure in the extreme, there's like, it's not healthy either. But in a normal hetero relationship, it's never a healthy dynamic where the woman is the source of all the adventure, of all the fun, of all the leadership. It's a much healthier thing for the man to be driving the motorcycle, if you will. And this relates to another deep topic when it comes to man-woman dynamics, which is the frame. Who is controlling the reality? And I know feminists maybe don't like this kind of language, but the truth is no neurotypical hetero woman wants to really be in charge of the frame in the relationship, right? If you ask any woman who's not traumatized by, her past with men, she wants to be swept off her feet. She wants to be taken on an adventure. She wants to be led. And it makes neurotypical, non-traumatized men feel really good. Like ask any straight guy if the feeling of when a woman puts her arm around your bicep and like there's this implicit body language communicating like, I want you to lead. Like I trust you. I trust where you're going to take us. That feels so good. And it's not just an ego thing. Like it feels good on a deep evolutionary level, on a deep, I would say archetypal level of like, oh yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. Now, I'm not trying to say that everyone needs to behave this way, but this is something that is consistent for almost all men and women. Now, in how to be the motorcycle, how to basically take over the frame, it reminds me of, well, one, actually a female coach of mine, a female mentor of mine would say this a lot. And I actually think she got it from somewhere else, but I don't know who to cite. But it's this phrase, when a woman is moving towards you, pull her in further than she was expecting to go. When a woman is moving away from you, push her away further than she was expecting to go. This adage points to the idea that you're always going to bring her in the same direction that she's choosing to go. Like you're not going against her will, but you're taking over the frame by taking it a little bit further. Because deep down, every woman wants to be swept off her feet, which means being with a man who's paying such close attention to her that he knows which direction she wants to go. He can interpret or foresee what she wants to do, but takes her in a way where she no longer has to have the onus of responsibility on her. Like she gets to pull her into a direction, take her on a fantasy ride, show her the world on his magic carpet in a way that she wanted to do, but she no longer has to think about what's going to happen because she trusts that he's feeling her feelings in a way that he's going to create an experience for her that she wanted to have and gets to be surprised about, which kind of goes back to the Christopher Hitchens thing of that for a woman to laugh at a man's jokes and find him humorous and charming, she needs to be kind of in a state where she's not foreseeing enough where she knows what the punchline is, right? She can be surprised. Like you can't laugh at something if you know what the punchline is going to be or if the punchline's predictable. It's the same thing in principle when it comes to everything in a relationship. Now, in order to do this, obviously, one, you need to really pay attention to the woman. If you caught my episode on the authentic flirting guide or what I call flirting by instinct, this is basically the crux of it. Like, can you pay attention to the woman you're with so well that you can essentially intuit what she wants, which is not a hard thing if you can get out of your head and pay attention to the woman. Actually, there's a number of married guys that I'm coaching right now, and these are guys who have been in a relationship with their partner, their wife for multiple years, but they're still having issues. And usually when I ask a guy, it's like, okay, based on your experience with your wife, your girlfriend, whatever, what did you think she actually wanted in this situation that led to a fight? Or based on your history with this woman, like, what do you think she actually wanted? And almost always the guy knows the answer, right? If you've been living with someone or you've been dating someone for multiple years, you probably know their patterns well enough. The issue, though, is most guys go in their head, or they, maybe because of their own traumas or wounds, they are thinking about like the way things are supposed to be or what makes logical sense, and they're missing the real person in front of them. They can't, they're not paying attention to the signals she's very clearly giving him, and then he ends up doing something based on what his idea is rather than reality, and that's what leads to the communication breakdown and all that stuff, right? But if you really pay attention, you can usually tell and then guide the woman in the way that she wants to be guided. But there's another deeper aspect to this, is that in order to do this well, in order to empathize well, you do need to be in touch with your own emotions, which goes back to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl thing, which is a guy who's really, the function of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in the film is that she helps the hero get in touch with his emotions. If he's really in touch with his emotions, he doesn't need her anymore. He might still want to interact with that cute, bubbly, adoring aspect of femininity, which is beautiful, but he doesn't need her to do that for him, right? He is in touch with his emotions enough. Like, I was thinking about different film tropes because of this episode, obviously. And it's interesting when you think of, like, say, the John Wayne type character, the strong, silent, stoic type. You could never imagine, even though the assumption is, okay, that's a guy who's disconnected from his feelings. A little analysis shows you that's not the case, right? John Wayne, in every movie he's ever been in, is very deeply connected to his feelings, but he doesn't need to show it to everybody, right? He's so grounded in that he doesn't need to, he doesn't need to emote a lot. He doesn't need to smile or like show a lot on his face. It's like, it's all deep inside of him, and he's connected to that inside of him. And if you think, like, there is no way you could possibly have a movie scene with a John Wayne type and a Zooey Deschanel type in the same. It just wouldn't make sense. Like, a John Wayne faced with an extreme Manic Pixie Dream Girl would be like, what is this? I don't have time for this, right? It's not to say that he's not attracted to femininity and like the youthfulness of women or whatever, but it just wouldn't make sense to him of like, why would he be drawn into a woman who needs him so much and the only thing she's bringing him is to help him feel his feelings? He's like, I got that already, right? I have other things, I have bandits to round up, or I have, people to save. Like, I don't have time for this kind of thing. And this is actually one of the reasons for a mini plug that 3 days in the 21-day Masculine Archetype Challenge focuses specifically on the anima and focuses on the student, the man, really connecting to his own feelings independent of women. And for guys who are in relationships, I do put in one of the lessons that if you're doing this work, notice how your partner may change in how she behaves towards you. Because women, especially in this case, are a deep reflection of a man's inner work, especially when it comes to the anima or his feelings. Because I've said this many times on the podcast, because it's something I deeply believe, that many guys get into personal development or spirituality and working on themselves because of women. Because of some dissatisfaction, maybe their dating life sucks and women just don't like them, or they keep getting friend zoned, or they're in a relationship where they don't feel respected, or there's a disconnect, or their marriage has been unfulfilling, or whatever it is. And that's the catalyst, or the entry point for most guys, because to be in a relationship that sucks, or to be an incel, for instance, like it's a miserable existence. But ultimately, I think every guy comes to the conclusion that might have been the catalyst, that might have been the reason. But one, the solution to that outside, these external relationships with women ultimately come down to what's inside and how I see myself as a man and how I am in touch with my own masculinity and my authenticity, and that'll actually fix the outside world. But really, that's the thing that I've wanted the whole time, right? Like, if I think of my own life of like, even this relationship I had with my ex who was an addict, it's like, it pointed to me, I was really disconnected from my feelings. And it put me on a journey where I needed to connect with my own anima, my own feelings, my own passions. And while it was great to have the result afterwards of like, oh, I never ended up in relationships like that ever again, and I found my confidence and my dating life became very abundant, and I became very confident and secure with women, and I had much better relationships after that. The real benefit, though, was the cause, if you will. The real benefit was that I actually liked myself for the first time, and I felt confident, I felt secure, and the great relationships with women on the outside, it was just a bonus. Which brings us to the final point of this episode, because I was thinking about also the protagonist in any Manic Pixie Dream Girl, fictional story. Again, if you think of Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character in 50 Shades of Summer, or any of these guys in these rom-coms where there's this Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Even though the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is a very common fantasy and is an attractive character to most men, in these movies, nobody wants to be the guy that she pairs with, right? Nobody wants to be Joseph Gordon-Levitt in 50 Shades of Summer. Nobody wants to be Edward Norton in the beginning, or, I don't remember the names of the characters in these other films, but like, he's kind of a loser, right? He's not a guy that you aspire to be with, right? But that's the kind of guy that pairs with the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. I was thinking, like, what is the opposite, or what is the type of man that pairs with the healthy aspect of the bubbly, romantic, adoring woman? And this might not be like the best example, but it is the movie that came to mind. I actually haven't seen this movie in its entirety, but I've seen bits of it on airplanes. And I was actually speaking with a client of mine about a certain scene from this movie, Vicky Cristina Barcelona. So in that movie, Javier Bardem's character is this kind of suave, charming, man who essentially approaches the two female protagonists, Vicky and Christina. One of them is played by Scarlett Johansson. I forget the other actress's name. And he invites them basically on a romantic adventure to make love with him and travel around Europe and whatever. And like, I think a lot of people or a lot of guys will watch certain scenes from this movie because he's got huge balls and he's super charming, but in a way that's not like, you know, over the top, and he's super secure and he's not pushy. He's very empathic. Like he's kind of like a super solid guy, but he also represents the opposite, or a type of guy that there wouldn't be room for the manic pixiness in the women, right? Both women actually in different ways become very girly in response to his, you know, unapologetic masculinity, but they're the ones at effect. He's the one leading the dance. He's the motorcycle, so to speak. He's leading them on an adventure where they get to be at effect. And essentially he's, you know, this is the term that I use, like he's being the daddy, right? He's being the one in charge, as opposed to the brooding male protagonist who's in his head in most Manic Pixie Dream Girl rom-coms, where he's totally out of control. Like he's not even the hero of his own story. He's dependent on a woman to lead him. And actually this brings us to the very last example. I mentioned the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, the way that Odysseus and his Argonauts were able to get past the siren, because if you're familiar with the myth, Odysseus, the captain, he wanted to hear this song. So he asked all the sailors, all the men to plug their ears so they couldn't hear, and they would tie him to the mast so that he could listen. And, you know, obviously he goes crazy because he wants to do anything he can to hear the siren song. The way that they were able to overcome, or, you know, get past the sirens without getting eaten, is that one of the members on the ship, Orpheus, who's in other myths, in other Greek myths of being like the best, I think he was a lyre player. Like he was a musician. He was like the best singer of all time. Orpheus was able to play even more beautiful music than the sirens. He was essentially able to seduce the seductresses in a sense. And relationally, when I've seen this a lot in my own life and in other guys that I've coached, that when faced with the Manic Pixie Dream Girl archetype, it's almost like a subtle test. I wouldn't call it a shit test, but it's almost like a subtle test in itself. It's like when a woman starts expressing this, there's an implied test here of like, on the one hand, she's expressing this hyper femininity in a way that's like, okay, I like you enough to show you my girly side. I like you enough to express this part of you that I know all men find attractive. Are you going to take the bait? Are you going to become at effect and let me lead the relationship? In which case, most women, I think, would either get bored if they're a secure woman, or maybe start using the man if she's not a secure woman. Or, you know, actually, I did want to mention this earlier. Like, I have a lot of female friends who are or were sex workers, and they've shared with me in ways that, you know, are just part of the job. It's like, it's part of the job to bring out this manic pixiness in you, to make the guy feel like the man. And, you know, that's what makes a guy spend more money, you know, if they're at a strip club or something. And there's obviously, you know, negative aspects to it, or aspects that are not natural. But for a normal, secure woman, she'll actually probably get bored with a guy who, when faced with their manic pixie awesomeness, or, you know, their beauty, goes into effect mode and like hops on the back of the motorcycle. And most secure women will actually get bored with the guy in that case, as opposed to, you know, say in Vicky Cristina Barcelona, that kind of Javier Bardem character who's like, oh, you're showing me your femininity? Awesome. I'm going to show you my passions, or I'm going to show you what's awesome about me. I'm going to outsing the siren and not crash into the rocks. Because not only is this a sign that the man is complete and secure, right? He's not taking the bait, so to speak, of the manic pixie dreamness, is that deep down, this is what women want, right? They want to be taken through these stages where at first, of course, they feel safe enough and attracted enough to bring out this girly side in them. But they don't want a man who then becomes a little boy in response to their girliness, or becomes a slave, a worshiper of this girliness, or on the flip side, becomes a savior where like the only way he knows how to interact with the damsel in distress, or you know, the very cute girliness in a woman is to solve all her problems for her in a way that she probably doesn't need, or she doesn't need to be infantilized in this way. What women really want deep down, the healthiest dynamic, is that he meets her. He's able to contain her, where she gets to be that free, sometimes innocent, sometimes girly version of herself. But he's also bringing it, right? He's also bringing passion and adventure and fun and excitement. And it's not all on her because, again, ultimately, a secure woman will get bored with a guy where she's constantly the only source of fun and excitement, and he's just there to solve her problems for her. So this was a deep dive on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl archetype. I hope it was useful for everyone, both on maybe some cultural understanding, but also how it shows up in actual relationships. If you are having relationship issues, or if you notice you're having a pattern in your relationships you don't like, feel free to reach out to me for coaching. There's a link to my website attached to this episode. And also, a lot of what I share in this episode comes from one of the chapters in my upcoming book, Taming the Anima, How to Understand the Feminine Psyche so well that, one, your external relationships with women will be great, whether it's in dating or in a long-term relationship where she feels safe enough. Women in general feel safe enough to bring out their healthy feminine side in the presence of your masculinity. But also, the deeper aspect of this is that women are a reflection of who you are as a man. And if women are either not giving you love or adoration, or they're giving you love or and adoration in a way that is draining to you and it's not a net positive for you, they don't seem to be served by you, your relationships aren't generating energy for you, it's actually pointing to something that, regardless of your relationships with women, is something that you want to solve in yourself, some wound that you have that needs healing. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and you haven't already, please rate me on Spotify or whatever app you're watching or listening on. I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.